There is a particular silence that lives inside a man who has lost someone and never learned exactly how. It is not the silence of grief, which moves and changes and eventually loosens. It is the silence of a question that was never answered, and Keanu Reeves had carried that silence for 8 years. Folded up small and kept in the same pocket where he kept an old brass pocket watch that had once belonged to his closest friend. The friend's name was Nate Calder, though no one who loved him had ever called him anything but Nate, and he had been dead for 8 years. And Keanu Reeves had built a great deal of his life since then around the shape of that absence. To understand the morning everything came apart, you have to understand who Nate was and what the two of them had made together, and why a watch mattered more than any amount of money either of them ever earned. Keanu Reeves was not, by the way most people would have guessed, a man of enormous public presence in the business he owned. He had come to it sideways. Years earlier, before there was money, he and Nate Calder had been two men with their hands and an idea. Nate, a trained watchmaker and restorer of old machines. Keanu, a designer with a feel for how objects should sit in a person's hand. And the two of them had started a small firm in San Francisco that made precision instruments and restored the kind of intricate, mechanical things the modern world had mostly stopped knowing how to fix. It grew. It grew in the slow, honest way that things grow when two people care more about the work than the growth. By the time it became Calder Reeves Instruments, a respected name with a headquarters on Montgomery Street, and contracts that reached across the country, Keanu Reeves had already learned the thing that would define how he moved through the rest of his life, which was that the men and women who actually built the beautiful objects were almost always invisible to the people who bought them, and that this was a kind of quiet crime the world had simply agreed to overlook. Keanu Reeves owned the majority of the company now, though he held it privately through a holding structure that kept his name off most of the paperwork, because he had never wanted to be the face of anything. He wanted to be the hands. He dressed plainly. He drove himself when he could. He was the kind of wealthy man that other wealthy men found faintly disappointing, because he refused to perform his wealth, and the refusal read to a certain kind of person as either an affectation or a weakness. He knew that. He had made his peace with being underestimated a long time ago. He had learned from Nate that being underestimated was often the most honest mirror a person could stand in front of. The watch was the thing. On the last birthday before Nate died, the two of them had made a pocket watch together, the only one of its kind, a collaboration they had talked about for years, and finally sat down and built, by hand over a series of long evenings at the workbench. Steel case, a hand-cut dial, and on the face, engraved by Nate himself, with the fine graver he had inherited from his own teacher, a single open wing. Making a watch by hand is not one skill but a stack of them, and Nate had all of them, which was rare even in the trade. He could cut and finish the tiny steel parts that most modern watchmakers only ever buy. He could hand engrave, which fewer and fewer people alive can do. Sitting at the bench with a graver and a steady breath, cutting metal away in curls so fine they catch the light like water. He understood escapements, the small beating heart of a mechanical watch, the part that parcels out time in even bites and makes the ticking sound that people find so comforting without ever knowing why. And he understood the thing that Keanu Reeves thought was the real secret of the craft, which was that a well-made mechanical watch is designed to be opened, to be serviced, to be understood by the next careful person who takes it apart. Because unlike almost everything else the modern world builds, it is made to be repaired rather than replaced. Made to outlive its maker and keep running in other hands. Nate used to say that a machine built to be repaired is a machine that believes in the future. Keanu Reeves had never forgotten it. It had been a private joke between them, and also not a joke at all. The wing, a reference to a night early in their friendship when they had been broke and sleeping in the shop. And Nate had said that everything they built was really just an attempt to give ordinary people one could carry them somewhere better. A wing, away, up, and out. Keanu had kept his own version of the design. The original drawings, the specification sheet with the serial they had assigned it, and Nate had kept the watch. And Nate had carried it every single day, until the night he drove off a cliff road on Highway 1 in Big Sur, and the ocean took the car, and, after 2 weeks of search operations, took the case with it, because the watch was never found, and the authorities closed the file, and Keanu Reeves had spent 8 years believing that the one perfect thing they had made together was lying at the bottom of the Pacific. He was wrong about that. He found out he was wrong on a gray December morning on Montgomery Street, and the finding out began, as these things do, with something small at the edge of his vision that his mind refused to let go of. He had been in the back of a car in slow traffic, on his way to a meeting he was already dreading, when he saw a man sitting on the cold pavement against the granite face of a bank building. Torn jacket, boots, split at the soles, a paper cup gone cold between his palms. One more invisible person on a street that had perfected the art of not seeing such people. The car had already moved half a block past him before Keanu Reeves understood what his eyes had caught. And by the time he understood it, he had already said the word out loud. Stop. Because around the man's neck, on a length of cord, because the original chain was long gone, hung a steel pocket watch, and even from the moving car, even in the flat gray light, Keanu Reeves had seen the shape engraved on its face. And it was a single open wing. He was out of the car before his driver had fully stopped it. He crossed the sidewalk. His head of security, a steady former investigator named Howard Raymond, who had worked for the firm for 11 years and had learned to read Keanu Reeves's silences better than most people read speech, was already moving with him because he had seen where Keanu's eyes were fixed and understood that something had changed in the shape of the day. And here was the thing Keanu Reeves saw in the 10 seconds it took to cross that sidewalk. The thing that told him more about the world than the watch did. The morning crowd of the financial district was moving around the man on the pavement, the way water moved the man on the pavement, the way water moves around a stone. Instinctively, without acknowledgement, thousands of dollars of wool coats, parting to flow past him and closing again on the other side, and not one person, in that river of people, looked down. A woman stepped over his outstretched boot without breaking her phone call. A man in a good suit adjusted his path by exactly the 18 inches required, and no more. The man on the pavement had become, through no fault of his own, a feature of the sidewalk rather than a person on it, and the crowd had performed the small daily miracle of unseeing that cities perform on their most invisible residents. And Keanu Reeves, who had spent his life watching precisely this, felt the old familiar anger move in him, quiet and cold. Burdassas, because he understood. Seated on a busy street in the richest city in the country wearing the answer to an 8-year-old mystery around his neck, and the world would step over him for years, rather than meet his eyes. The man on the pavement did not look up until Keanu Reeves crouched down a few feet from him, bringing himself lower, closer to the man's level, the way you approach something you do not want to frighten. The man's eyes, when they finally rose, were dark and weary and exhausted, the eyes of someone who had learned that strangers who crossed a sidewalk toward him almost never brought anything good, but they were not vacant. That was the first thing Keanu Reeves noticed. Guarded, yes, broken in some places, certainly, but not empty. There was a person still living behind them. That watch, Keanu Reeves said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Where did you get it?" The man's hand moved instantly to his chest, closing around the steel case, a gesture so fast and so protective that it told its own story. "I didn't steal it," he said. His voice was low and rough at the edges, but the words came out clearly, without flinching. "I didn't say you did," Keanu Reeves said. "I'm asking where it came from." The man stared at him for a long moment. Around them the city went on with its indifferent roar, buses and voices, and a jackhammer somewhere uptown. And then the man said the thing that made the noise of the street fall away. "I don't know," he said. "I woke up with it. 8 years ago. In a hospital." Keanu Reeves had prepared himself, in the half-second of crossing the sidewalk, for a dozen answers. A pawn shop. A trade. A story about someone who had owned it before. He had not prepared himself for that one. 8 years ago. The same October. The same stretch of coast. The same black water that had taken Nate Calder off a cliff road and never given him back. "You woke up with it," Keanu Reeves repeated. The man nodded. "I didn't have a name," he said, without any particular emotion, the way people describe things they have long since stopped trying to explain to anyone. "I didn't have anything. Just this." His fingers stayed over the case. "It's the only thing that's been with me the whole time." Keanu Reeves looked at this man, at the size of him, even folded down small against the cold granite, at the quiet that lived in him, underneath the wreckage of his circumstances, and felt something shift in his chest that he could not yet name and did not try to. He had spent 8 years learning to keep that particular door closed. He was not going to let it swing open on a public sidewalk in front of a stranger. But he also was not going to walk away. Every rational function he had was telling him that there was a rope here, a thin frayed rope leading back into the dark of a night he had never understood, and that the man in front of him was holding the other end of it and did not know. "What do they call you?" Keanu Reeves asked. "Elias," the man said. "The nurses gave me that. Wren was just what the shelter put on the forms. Elias Wren. A name assembled by strangers out of other people's practicality, filled into blank boxes by people who had needed something to write." Keanu Reeves absorbed it. Then he did the thing that Howard Raymond, standing a careful step behind him, would later say was the moment he knew the next several weeks of all their lives had just been decided. "Mr. Wren," Keanu Reeves said, "there's a suite at a building we keep a few blocks from here. Warm room, food, a doctor if you'll see one. I'm not asking you to do anything, except sit somewhere warm and tell me, if you can, how that watch ended up around your neck." He let it settle. "Because I think I know who made it. And I think you might be the only person alive who knows what happened to the man who was wearing it." Elias Wren looked at Howard Ryman, then back at Keanu Reeves. "Why would you do that?" he asked. It was a fair question, a reasonable one, and Keanu Reeves, who usually had an answer ready for everything, found that he did not have a clean one. "Because a friend of mine made that watch," he said finally. "And he's been gone 8 years. And you just told me you woke up in a hospital 8 years ago, with no name and no memory and only that. So either you can tell me something about the night that happened, or the watch can. Either way, I need to know." Elias Wren looked down at the cold cup in his hands. He set it carefully on the pavement beside him, a small, precise act of tidiness in the middle of ruin, and something about that gesture, the care of it, went straight through Keanu Reeves, because it was exactly the kind of thing Nate would have done. "I have dreams about water," Elias said quietly. "I don't know what they mean." He looked up. "I'll come." The suite the firm kept on the 14th floor of a building near the waterfront existed in a different atmosphere from the street below it. Warm light, wide windows, furniture chosen by someone who understood comfort as a form of precision. Elias Wren stood in the center of it and looked around the way a man looks at something he has lost the vocabulary to describe. Keanu Reeves had already called Dr. Naomi Frost, a physician the firm retained, before they had even arrived, and by the time Elias had eaten, quietly and methodically, the meal of a man who had learned never to waste anything, Dr. Frost was setting up in the adjoining room. Keanu Reeves watched him eat, and it told him things. Elias Wren cut his food into small pieces, and finished everything on the plate, and folded his napkin at the end. Not out of manners exactly, but out of a discipline that looked older than his circumstances. The discipline of a man who had once been trained to be careful with his hands, and had never entirely lost it, even when everything else was taken. He thanked the person who brought the food and looked them in the eye when he did it, which is a thing many people who have never been invisible fail to do. And almost every person who has been invisible does without fail, because they know exactly what it costs to go unthanked. Keanu Reeves had spent his whole life reading people by the small unguarded things they did when they thought no one was measuring them. And everything Elias Wren did in that first hour told the same quiet story, which was that somewhere under the wreckage was a person of real and specific care. A person the street had worn down, but had not managed to erase. The examination took the better part of an hour. Keanu Reeves waited in the sitting area, with a tablet dark in his hands, staring at the middle distance, at 8 years of unanswered questions rearranging themselves into something with a shape. When Dr. Frost came out, she sat across from him and chose her words with the care of someone delivering information that could not be taken back. Significant retrograde amnesia, she said. Consistent with severe blunt force trauma to the head combined with a near drowning and prolonged hypothermia. His body carries the record of it. Healed fractures along the left side of the rib cage. Scarring consistent with a long time in cold water. She kept her voice clinical and level. If a man went into the ocean off that coast in October and survived it, medically speaking, it would be remarkable. Most people do not. Keanu Reeves said nothing. His memory exists in fragments, Dr. Frost went on. He can function, learn, hold a job in principle, form new memories. He has done all of that for 8 years. But the period before his hospitalization is largely inaccessible to him, and what does come through is sensory rather than narrative. Sound, temperature, feeling, not story. It is worth understanding that this is not the amnesia of films, where a blow to the head restores everything. Retrograde amnesia of this kind rarely reverses cleanly. What returns, returns in pieces, and often only when something in the present reaches back and touches the right nerve. There is a whole quiet machinery, Dr. Frost added, that is supposed to catch a person like him. And it is worth knowing how it is supposed to work, because in his case, it did not. When an unidentified patient comes into a hospital, they become what the records call a John Doe or a Jane Doe, and there are procedures. Fingerprints run against databases. Photographs circulated. Missing persons reports cross-checked. Social workers assigned. A patient with catastrophic injuries and no identity is supposed to be held and worked. Not discharged, precisely because they cannot advocate for themselves. And the entire point of the system is that the people who cannot speak for themselves are the ones it is supposed to protect most carefully. She looked at Keanu Reeves steadily. For that system to fail this completely, for a man in his condition to be moved to a shelter within a week, with none of that done and his file marked resolved, someone did not simply drop the ball. Someone picked it up and put it away. That last sentence sat in the room for a moment, because it was the first time anyone had said out loud what the thinness of the record already implied. That last sentence would matter, more than either of them knew when she said it. After Dr. Frost left, Keanu Reeves went back in to Elias Wren, who was sitting by the window looking out at the bay with the quiet disorientation of a man trying to locate himself in a world that had moved on without him for 8 years. Keanu sat down across from him. "What do you remember?" he asked. "From before the hospital, anything." Elias was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, it came slowly, like something being pulled up from deep water. "Sound mostly," he said. "Waves. Big ones. A voice, close to me, saying something urgent I can't hear. Cold that gets into your bones and stops you from thinking." His jaw tightened. "And a feeling like I was supposed to do something, carry something, get somewhere." He touched the watch at his chest without seeming to notice he was doing it. "And someone pressing this into my hands," he added, "telling me to go. That's all I have." Keanu Reeves kept his face composed, but inside, a slow, deep mechanism had started turning, and it felt like inevitability. "Then, we're going to find out what happened to you," he said. "I have someone I trust. I'm going to ask you to let a doctor keep working with you, and to trust me the same way I just trusted you when you told me you didn't steal that watch." Elias Wren turned from the window and looked at him directly. The first time, he had done so without the reflexive armor of a man who has been invisible so long that being seen feels like a threat. "Why does the watch matter so much to you?" he asked. "This friend of yours. What was he like?" The question arrived in Keanu Reeves's chest like something dropped from a height. "He was stubborn," Keanu said, "and gentle, and he never in his life did a single thing without a reason." His voice stayed even. "Which is the only reason I can think of that his watch is around your neck instead of at the bottom of the ocean. He put it there. I just don't know why yet." The man Keanu Reeves trusted to find out was a former federal agent named Howard Raymond, who had done investigative work for the firm for over a decade, and had learned, across a long career, that the most important facts were almost never the ones people first reported. Keanu set him loose that same evening, and by the following morning, Howard was already pulling threads. It took Howard 4 days to find the first one. He came to Keanu Reeves's office on a Thursday afternoon and set a folder on the desk without preamble. Inside was a photocopy of a hospital intake record from Coast Ridge General, a regional hospital serving the stretch of coast below Bjurgfber, dated 8 years earlier, 3 days after Nate Calder's car had gone off the cliff road. The patient was listed as John Doe. Adult male, approximate age late 20s, recovered from the water near the base of a coastal cliff. Severe head trauma, hypothermia. Near drowning. The record was thin, and the follow-up notes were sparse in a way that read, to Howard's trained eye, less like negligence and more like something closer to intention. "He was there," Howard said, "same night, same water, same base of the same cliff your friend drove off of." Keanu Reeves read the record twice. His hands were steady on the paper. "Keep going," he said. Howard kept going, and what he brought back 2 days later was the part that made the room feel smaller. A night shift nurse who had worked the emergency ward at Coast Ridge General 8 years earlier. A woman named Loretta Ames, now retired and 68 years old, and living in a small town inland, had agreed to speak with Howard on the condition that her name stay out of anything public until it had to be in. She remembered the John Doe clearly, she said, and the reason she remembered him was not the injuries, though they were bad. She remembered him because of what happened after he stabilized. Loretta Ames had spent 40 years in emergency nursing, and she carried that experience the way some people carry a second spine. When Keanu Reeves went to see her himself, a few days later, driving inland alone, because it felt wrong to send anyone else, she made him coffee in a kitchen full of framed photographs and told him the story plainly, without drama, because she had learned a long time ago, and that decorating it usually means you are hiding something. There was a man came to the ward, she said, 3 or 4 days after they pulled that boy out of the water. Well-dressed. Polite. Polite, in the particular way people are polite when they want something and are used to getting it. He asked about the John Doe specifically. Whether he'd said anything. Whether anyone had identified him. Whether the family had been contacted. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. There was no family to contact, she said. No identification. Nothing to go on but a watch on a cord that nobody thought twice about, because half the folks who come through that ward have some keepsake on them, and it never means anything. She had watched the well-dressed man leave an envelope with the charge nurse. She had not seen what was in it, but she had seen the charge nurse's whole manner change in the days that followed, and she had seen the John Doe, a young man with catastrophic injuries, and no memory and no name, discharged within the week, not to a rehabilitation facility where a person in his condition belonged, but to a city shelter 2 hours north. Still with no name. Still with no follow-up care arranged. His file marked. Resolved. I filed a concern, Loretta Ames said, quietly through the proper channel. It went nowhere, and I was told, not in so many words but clearly enough, that a nurse near the end of her career did not want to make trouble over the disposition of a patient who did not officially exist. She looked at Keanu Reeves across the table. So I kept my head down. And I have thought about that boy every year since, at the end of every October, and I have hated myself a little every time. She set down her cup. When your man called me, she said, it was the first full breath I've taken about it in 8 years. That's not your failure, Keanu Reeves said. It's the failure of everyone above you who made sure you couldn't act. Maybe, Loretta Ames said, but he was still a person, and I still knew. Keanu Reeves asked her the question he had driven 2 hours to ask. The man who came to the ward, he said. Did she ever see his face? Loretta Ames got up, went to a drawer, and came back with a folded piece of paper she had kept for 8 years without ever quite knowing why. It was a photocopy of a photocopy, a still from the hospital parking lot's security camera. Grainy and badly lit, but clear enough. She had made herself a copy, she said, the week it happened, and hidden it, because 40 years in emergency rooms had taught her that the things people most want to disappear are exactly the things worth keeping. Keanu Reeves looked at the face in the grainy photograph for a long time. It was Preston Halloway. Preston Halloway had sat on the board of Calder Reeves Instruments for the better part of 14 years. He had come in early as an investor when the firm needed capital, and Keanu and Nate had needed someone who understood money the way they understood machines. He had smiled at Keanu Reeves across a conference table on the first Monday of nearly every month for over a decade. He had spoken at Nate's memorial. He had, in the last 2 issues, been quietly and methodically assembling the shareholder support he would need to force Keanu Reeves out of control of the company the 2 friends had built. On the argument that Keanu was a sentimental craftsman unfit to run a firm that had outgrown him, and in approximately 36 hours, he was going to have the votes to call for it formally. Keanu Reeves set the photograph face down on Loretta Ames's kitchen table. He thanked her. He asked her, gently, whether she would be willing to say all of it again. On the record, when the time came, and Loretta Ames looked at him with 40 years of held breath in her eyes and said that she had been waiting 8 years for someone to ask. Then he drove back to the city in the dark. And somewhere on the coast road, with the black ocean on his left exactly where it had taken Nate, a great many things that had never fit together began, quietly and terribly, to fit. Because now Keanu Reeves understood the shape of it. Nate Calder had found something. That was the only thing that made the rest cohere. Nate had found something about Preston Halloway. Something that threatened him badly enough. That Nate's careful, ordinary life had ended on a cliff road at night. And Elias Wren had been there. And Elias had survived when he was not supposed to. and Preston had found him in a hospital bed, with no name, and no memory, and had made the coldly rational decision that the safest thing was not to finish him, but simply to erase him. To let a man with no name and no history and no resources dissolve into the streets of a city that had already agreed not to see him. Preston had bet that a homeless man with no memory would never be in a position to be believed by anyone, and for 8 years the bet had paid. He had been wrong about exactly one thing. He had assumed the watch was gone. He had assumed that whatever Nate might have been carrying had gone into the ocean with him. He had not imagined that Nate, in whatever time he had pressed the one object that could serve as a bridge into the hands of the one person who might survive to carry it, and had trusted, with the last of his engineer's faith in cause and effect, that if the watch ever surfaced, the one man alive who would recognize it would be standing close enough to see. Keanu Reeves drove through the dark with both hands steady on the wheel, and understood that his friend, in the last minutes he had built one final mechanism, the most important one of his life, out of a watch and a stranger and 8 years of blind hope, and had set it running, and that it had just, on a gray morning on Montgomery Street, finally struck the hour. The next morning he went back to the suite, and he told Elias Wren the truth, all of it, plainly, because the man had earned plainness, and because Keanu Reeves did not believe in protecting people from the shape of their own lives. He told him about Nate, about the firm, about the watch and the wing and the night on the cliff road, about Loretta Ames and the envelope and the parking lot photograph, about Preston Halloway, who in a little over a day would move to take the company, and who 8 years ago had decided that Elias Wren's entire existence could simply be subtracted from the world to keep a secret buried. Elias Wren listened to all of it without moving. When Keanu finished, the man did not collapse into shock. Something in his face went harder and quieter instead, a kind of cold, clear focus, and he was silent for a long time, and then he said one word, Nate. It was not a question. It sat strangely in his mouth, like a thing he had found and could not yet claim. That's his name, Keanu Reeves said carefully. How did you? I don't know, Elias Wren said. He pressed 2 fingers against his sternum, over where the watch had hung. The dream. The man pressing this into my hands. He says a name when he does it. I've heard it 8 years and never had a word for it. His eyes came up. Nate. He was the one, on the cliff. He was the man in the water with me. He gave me this, and told me to run. Keanu Reeves felt the room tilt very slightly. The way a room does when something you have carried alone for years is suddenly, unbearably shared. Yes, he said. I think he did. Then there's something else, Elias Wren said slowly. And this was the part that neither of them had seen coming, the part that turned the whole thing from a matter of proving what had happened into a matter of finishing what Nate had started. He turned the watch over in his scarred hands, the way a man turns something he has held 10,000 times without ever really looking at it. And he worked a fingernail into the seam of the back case, the hinged cover that protects the movement, and it opened, the way Nate had built it to open, smoothly, on a catch only someone who knew watches would ever find. And on the inside of the cover, engraved by hand, in letters so fine they could only have been cut with a master's graver, was not a wing. It was a string of numbers and 2 words, and Keanu Reeves leaned in and read them, and felt the last 8 years reorganize themselves one final time. Because it was not a decoration. It was a location. It was where Nate Calder had hidden whatever he had found, engraved on the inside of the one object he trusted to survive him, in a code only Keanu Reeves would ever be able to read. Because the 2 words were the name of the workbench they had shared when they had nothing. A private thing no other living person knew. Nate had not just left a witness. He had left a map. They had less than 36 hours, and Keanu Reeves spent the first 6 of them following the map. The engraving led, as Keanu understood it, the moment he read the 2 words, to a long-term storage vault under a false name at a facility Nate had used years earlier to keep restoration materials, a place the 2 of them had joked about because the workbench name was the access phrase Nate had set for it back when they were young and broke, and certain no one would ever care what 2 watchmakers kept in a locker. Keanu Reeves had forgotten the place existed. Nate had not. Nate had gone there at some point in the last weeks of his life and left behind a sealed case, and inside the case was the thing that had cost him his life. It was a paper trail in the most literal sense. Nate Calder had been meticulous the way only a watchmaker can be meticulous. And what he had assembled was a complete and documented record of a long-running financial fraud that Preston Halloway had been operating through the firm for years. A scheme of shell entity, falsified restoration contracts, and siphoned funds that had quietly moved a fortune out of the company and into accounts Preston controlled. There was a moment going through it on the vault floor when Keanu Reeves nearly got the wrong man, and it is worth saying so, because it is exactly the trap Nate had had to work his own way out of. The forged signatures on the falsified contracts were not Preston Halloway's. They belonged to a mid-level operations manager named Wendell Frayed, a nervous, careful functionary whose name was on everything, and for a bad half hour, Keanu Reeves sat with the documents and believed he was looking at Frayed's crime, a small man skimming from a big company. It was only when he followed the money past the contracts, the way Nate's own notes told him to, the way Nate had clearly followed it himself, that the picture inverted. Frayed's signatures were on the paper, because Frayed had been made to sign, a man kept frightened and compliant, and positioned to take the fall if the thing ever came apart. The money did not stop with Frayed. It moved through him and past him, through the shell entities, and every path, when you followed it far enough, arrived at the same quiet place, which was Preston Halloway. Nate had left a note about it in his own hand. 3 words underlined twice, not the signer, and Keanu Reeves understood that his friend had walked into the same trap and climbed out of it, and had wanted to make sure that whoever came after would not waste time blaming the frightened man whose name was on the page. Nate had found the first thread by accident. The way honest people usually find these things, a discrepancy in a restoration invoice that did not match any work their shop had actually done, and he had pulled on it, quietly, for months, because he had not wanted to believe it, and because he had known that the moment he was certain, he would have to do something that would blow apart the firm and the friendships inside it. He had documented everything. Bank records, falsified contracts bearing forged signatures, a reconstruction of the money's path that a forensic accountant would later call the single cleanest piece of amateur fraud documentation he had ever seen. And he had been 3 days from bringing it to Keanu Reeves when his car went off the cliff road. Keanu Reeves sat on the floor of a storage vault in the middle of the night with 8 years of his life open in a case in front of him, and did not move for a long time. Then he called Diane Pruitt, the firm's general counsel, and he called Howard Raymond, and he began, in the few hours he had, to build the thing his friend had died trying to build. Diane Pruitt was a careful woman who had spent her career learning that the threshold for this kind of accusation was unforgiving, not because the truth was ever in doubt, but because power has a reliable habit of defending itself, regardless of the truth. She assembled the evidence with the precision of someone who understood that they would get exactly one attempt. Nate's documentation, the forensic reconstruction of the fraud, the Coast Ridge General intake record, Loretta Ames's signed statement, the parking lot photograph, Dr. Frost's medical findings on Elias Wren, and the watch itself, with its engraving, the physical object that tied a dead man's hidden evidence to a living man's stolen 8 years. Authenticated against the original design drawings and the serial number that Keanu Reeves had kept in a drawer for a decade, proving beyond any argument that it was the one and only watch of its kind, made by the very man Preston Halloway had spoken about so movingly at the memorial. Elias Wren asked to be part of it. Keanu Reeves had not asked him to, had in fact told him plainly that he owed the company nothing and could walk away from the whole thing, and no one would think less of him. That the fraud was Keanu's fight, and the medical bills and a quiet place to live were his regardless. But Elias Wren had looked at him and said that this was not about the company for him either. This was about a man named Nate, who had used the last strength he had to save a stranger. And about 8 years subtracted from his life by someone who had decided he was too insignificant to bother killing. That, Elias Wren said, deserves an answer. Then let's make sure he gets one, Keanu Reeves said. The night before the board meeting, Keanu found Elias Wren in the study of the suite at 2 a.m, with the lights still on, 3 books on corporate governance open in front of him, and a legal pad covered in careful notes, teaching himself, in the hours he had, the exact machinery of the room he was about to walk into. It was the same quality of focused stillness Keanu had watched in Nate 100 times, and it went through him like something both familiar and impossible, and he stood in the doorway a moment and did not say what he was feeling, because there were no words for it that would not have broken them both. Elias Wren had questions, and they were not the questions of a man in shock. They were specific and structural. He wanted to know whether a board could legally suspend a scheduled vote once a motion had been placed on the agenda, and Diane Pruitt had explained to him that it could, that a board has both a right and a fiduciary duty to table a motion when new material information calls its legitimacy into question, and that a motion introduced by a person who is himself under credible investigation for fraud is exactly the kind of motion a board is obligated to stop, rather than permitted to stop. He wanted to know about the chain of custody on the financial documents, whether a reconstruction assembled by a dead man years earlier could hold up. And Diane had walked him through how Nate's original work had been independently rebuilt from source records overnight, so that the case did not rest on Nate's papers alone, but on the bank's own data, which no one could accuse of having a motive. He wanted to know, most of all, whether Preston Halloway could simply deny everything, and Diane had told him the truth, which was that Preston would deny everything. That guilty men in rooms like this one almost always do, and that the entire purpose of a clean paper trail is to make the denial irrelevant, to build a case that does not require the accused to admit anything, because the documents admit it for him. He was, Diane Pruitt said quietly to Keanu Reeves after Elias had gone to sleep for a few hours, the fastest study she had briefed in 20 years. She said it the way people say things when they have understood something they had not expected to understand, and Keanu Reeves knew exactly what she meant, because he had felt it too, the particular ache of watching a man the world had thrown away turn out to have, still intact underneath 8 years of ruin, precisely the kind of careful, disciplined mind the world claims to prize and reliably fails to notice when it is wearing the wrong coat. The boardroom of Calder Reeves Instruments occupied a corner of the 14th floor with tall windows on 2 sides and a long table of dark walnut, and by 10 minutes to 10 the following morning, 11 of the 12 board members were already seated. Coffee and leather folders, and the low murmur of people who believed they already knew how the hour would go. Preston Halloway stood near the head of the table in a charcoal suit, talking easily with 2 of the members he had spent the last month cultivating. He was a man who had prepared, for years, for a single morning, and he wore that preparation like a good coat. He checked his watch. He did not look toward the door. He did not need to. Keanu Reeves's chair was empty, and every minute it stayed empty made the story Preston had built settle more firmly into place. At 2 minutes to 10, the door opened, and Keanu Reeves walked in, and beside him walked a man in a plain dark suit that had been made the previous afternoon, and every head at the table turned. Preston Holloway's easy expression recalibrated the way a calculation adjusts when a new variable appears. His eyes moved from Keanu Reeves to the man beside him, and stayed there, and for just a moment, before he closed it down, something crossed his face that Keanu Reeves had waited 8 years to see, which was recognition, and underneath the recognition, fear. Keanu Reeves took his chair. Elias Wren sat to his left. Diane Pruitt and one of her associates took seats along the wall, with a document box open between them. And Keanu Reeves, who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and had learned to let it happen, addressed the table in the plain, quiet voice he used for everything, and did not raise it once, because he had finally reached the one morning in his life when he did not need to. "I know there's a motion on the agenda," he said. "I'll get to it. But first I need to introduce someone, and I need to tell you all a story about a watch." He set the steel pocket watch on the walnut table where every person in the room could see it, and he told them, in the same unhurried voice, what it was. He told them about the wing, and about the 2 men who had made it, and about the one of them who had carried it every day until the night his car went off a cliff road on Highway 1. He watched the members who had known Nate go still. Then he introduced the man sitting to his left. "This is Elias Wren," Keanu Reeves said. 8 years ago, he was pulled out of the ocean at the base of that same cliff on the same night, with severe head trauma, and no memory, and no name. And he has spent the 8 years since living on the streets of this city, because a member of this board made certain he stayed there. The room went the specific kind of wrong that is worse than an eruption. Not noise. The charged silence of 12 people watching everything they had believed about the morning rearrange itself in front of them. Preston Holloway spoke first, and his voice was measured, almost warm. The voice of a reasonable man addressing an unfortunate scene. "Keanu," he said, spreading his hands slightly. "I know the last 2 years have been difficult for you. I know how much Nate meant to you. But bringing a stranger into a board meeting and making these kinds of accusations without any. The documentation session is in front of you." Diane raising her voice. Tab 3. A forensic reconstruction of 11 years of falsified restoration contracts and the movement of company funds through 3 shell entities, assembled originally by Nate Calder before his death, and independently verified last night by a forensic accounting firm. Tab 5. The intake record from Coast Ridge General, placing an unidentified survivor at the base of the cliff the same night. Tab 6. A signed statement from Loretta Ames, the emergency nurse, who witnessed your visit to that ward, and the envelope you left with the charge nurse. Tab 7. The parking lot photograph. And Tab 8. The authentication of the watch on this table against the original design drawings and serial record, confirming it as the one made by Mr. Calder and worn by him on the night he died. Cornelius Vane, the oldest person at the table, who had put the first outside money into the firm back when Keanu and Nate were still sleeping in the shop, and who had loved Nate Calder like a nephew, had already opened his copy of the package and was turning pages, and his face was doing something slow and terrible. "This is a fabrication," Preston Holloway said. His composure had not broken, and Keanu Reeves thought, with a kind of distant professional respect, that it was genuinely impressive, the composure of a man who had rehearsed for exposure, but had rehearsed for a smaller one than this. "Keanu has spent 2 years watching his position erode And this is a desperate, frankly cruel attempt to sit down, Preston. The voice came from Cornelius Vane, and it was quiet, and it was final. Preston Holloway did not sit right away. And here is where the story refuses the easy ending, because Preston Holloway did not crumble, and he did not confess, and he did not weep. Men like Preston Holloway do not. What he did instead was the thing that men like him always do, which is to fight. And the fight is always, in the end, the thing that finishes them. He stood for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and then, instead of sitting, he changed the subject, smoothly, the way a man changes a subject when he has decided the facts are no longer his best ground. He turned to the table, and he said that, whatever the documents appeared to show, the board should ask itself a harder question, which was what exactly Keanu Reeves had been doing for the past 2 weeks. And he told them that Keanu Reeves had taken a mentally incapacitated homeless man off the street, a man with documented brain damage and no capacity to consent, had installed him in a company property, had coached him, had put words in his mouth and a suit on his back, and had produced him here as a puppet to save Keanu's own failings, store designed to save Keanu's own failing grip on the company. It is not evidence, Preston Holloway said, his voice rising into something that was almost conviction. It is the manipulation of a vulnerable, damaged man by a desperate one. And I think this board should be very careful about the liability it takes on if it acts on the testimony of a person who cannot even remember his own name. It was, Keanu Reeves would think later, a genuinely clever move because it took the most sympathetic fact in the room, the wreckage of Elias Wren, and tried to turn it into a weapon. And in the silence after Preston said it, Keanu Reeves felt the room tilt, felt 2 or 3 of the members who had been cultivated begin, almost against their will, to reach for the exit Preston had just built them. And then Elias Wren, who had not said a single word since he entered the room, spoke for the first time. "I can't remember the night it happened," he said. His voice was low and even, and he did not address it to Preston Holloway, but to the table at large. "I woke up in a hospital not knowing my name. I spent 8 years on the street. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me." He looked for the first time directly at Preston Holloway. "I'm telling you because the man who made those decisions about my life believed it made me a person who could never be believed. He built everything on that." He looked back at the table. "I'd like you to think about what it means that he's standing here right now, doing it again." The room was very quiet. "I don't need to remember the night," Elias Wren said, "to read what's engraved inside this watch. I don't need to remember my own name to know that a forensic firm verified those documents last night, or that a nurse kept a photograph for 8 years, or that the drawings in that folder match the watch on this table." He set his scarred hands flat on the walnut. "My memory is the one thing in this room that isn't evidence. Everything else is." He looked at Preston Holloway one more time, and his voice did not rise. "You were almost right about me," he said. "You were only wrong about one thing. You thought no one would ever be standing close enough to recognize it." Diane Pruitt let the silence hold for exactly 1 breath, and then she addressed the board in the flat, clear voice of someone reading a verdict that had already been written by the facts. "The motion for a leadership change," she said, "was not merely moot. It had been introduced by a man against whom the board now held documented evidence of an 11-year fraud, and credible evidence of far worse. And the board had both the right and the legal obligation to table it, and to move on nature of the documentation for Preston Holloway's removal, pending the involvement of authorities who were, she noted, already in the building." The vote on Preston Holloway's removal took 4 minutes, and it was unanimous. Preston's counterattack did not end in the boardroom, because men like Preston do not stop when the room turns. Over the days that followed, while the forensic firms and the financial crimes investigators began the long work of tracing 11 years of stolen money, Preston Halloway went to work the only way he knew how. He hired his own experts, who produced reports, arguing that Elias Wren's brain damage rendered every one of his statements legally worthless. He let it be whispered to a few reporters and a few remaining allies that Keanu Reeves had gone unstable with grief and had built an elaborate fantasy around a dead friend and a broken stranger. And, most fatefully, he reached out privately to the retired charge nurse who had accepted his envelope 8 years earlier, a woman who had long since moved out of state, and offered to make her comfortable if she would sign a statement swearing that no envelope had ever changed hands, and that Loretta Ames was a bitter, unreliable former colleague, settling an old grudge. And that was the thing that finished him, because a fraud that is merely old can sometimes be argued into a fog. But a fresh, documented attempt to buy a false statement and suborn a witness is a new crime, committed in the present tense, where the evidence is clean. The charge nurse, frightened and 8 years older and tired of carrying it, did not sign. She recorded the conversation instead, and she brought it to the investigators. And the attempt to bury the past detonated an investigation into the present that was faster and far less forgiving than the fraud case would ever have been. When investigators pulled that single thread, they did not find one desperate act. They found a pattern, a man who had spent a career solving his problems by paying the right person to make an inconvenient fact disappear. And the deeper they went, the worse it looked. And the machine Preston Halloway had built over years to protect himself came apart the way those machines always do once the light gets into them, all at once. After holding for a long time, he was not merely removed from the board. The fraud and the 8-year-old disappearance of Ositsmas and the fresh attempt to suborn one moved the matter fully out of the world of shareholders and into the world of prosecutors. There was, in time, a charge related to Nate Calder's death itself, though the ocean had kept its secrets too well for that to ever be as clean as anyone wanted, and this is one of the places the story stays honest. Because Keanu Reeves never did get to stand in a courtroom and hear a jury say the word that would have named exactly what happened on that cliff road. Some of what the water took, it kept. What could be proven was proven, and it was enough to end Preston Halloway. And it was not enough to give Keanu Reeves the single clean-sense answer he had wanted for 8 years. And both of those things were true at once. And he had to learn to hold them together. There was a night, months later, when it was all coming down around him, that Preston Halloway sat alone and did the thing such men almost never do, which was to see himself clearly. And it did him no good at all, because by then it was far too late. He thought, perhaps for the first time, about the young man in the hospital bed, the John Doe with no name, and about how easy it had been, how little it had cost him, to decide that such a person could simply be erased. He understood, alone, with nothing left to protect, that he had built his whole life on the certainty that some people did not count, and that this one certainty which had served him for decades had finally reached out and destroyed him, because the one person he had been holding the other end of the rope had turned out to be the one holding the other end of the rope. He never apologized. Some part of him grasped that an apology would be one more performance, and the single, almost decent instinct he had left was to spare everyone the theater of it. And even that was years too late to mean anything. Keanu Reeves took no satisfaction in the fall. He had spent his life watching the world overlook the people who mattered most, and he could not find it in himself to enjoy watching even Preston Halloway be overlooked by no one at last. He had done only one thing that was truly a choice rather than a consequence, which was to say the word stop in the back of a car on a gray morning. And everything after that had simply been the truth, held long enough underwater, finally rising. The last thing needed doing, and it belonged to Elias Wren, not to Keanu, so Keanu did not go with him. Howard Raymond found Ruth Calder without much trouble, because she had never been hiding. She was Nate's older sister, 61 now, and she had spent 8 years grieving a brother, whose death had never quite made sense to her. Because Nate had called her 3 days before the crash, agitated in a way she had never heard from him, and had told her he had found something at the firm, and did not yet know what to do about it, and had made her promise that if anything ever happened to him, she would remember that he had said it. She had remembered it for 8 years, alone, unable to make anyone else take it seriously. A woman holding a single loose thread that led nowhere. When Keanu Reeves called her and told her that the thread led, in the end, everywhere, she did not speak for a long moment. And then Ruth Calder did the thing that let Keanu finally set down a weight he had carried since the memorial, which was to tell him that Nate had loved him. Plainly. The way you love the person you built yourself's work beside. And that whatever had happened on that cliff road, Nate had gone toward it trying to protect the thing the two of them had made. Some griefs do not close, but some of them at least stop being lonely, and that is not nothing. Elias Wren got his real name back, in time, or as much of it as the records could recover, and it turned out to be a name that had once belonged to a young man who apprenticed at a watch and instrument shop, a young man Nate Calder had taken on and taught, which was how Nate had trusted him with the watch in the first place, because Elias Wren had been, before the water took his memory, exactly the kind of person Nate's spent his life betting on, the invisible young worker with careful hands whom the world had not yet decided to see. He did not recover the 8 years. No one gets those back. But he recovered the hands. Keanu Reeves gave him a place at the bench, not out of charity, which Elias would have refused, but because a firm that restores precision machines needs people who can feel the work. And Elias Wren, it turned out, could feel it the way almost no one can, the way Nate had, in a life he could not remember. Everything his hands still knew. At NZC, 3 weeks after it was over, on a quiet Sunday, Keanu Reeves and Elias Wren sat at a workbench in the back of the shop on Montgomery Street with the watch open between them and Elias, whose hands remembered a craft his mind had lost, cleaned and oiled the movement Nate Calder had built, and set it running again for the first time in 8 years. And the two of them sat and listened to it tick in the quiet, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. And that, in the end, was the closest thing to an answer that the ocean was ever going to give back. I keep coming back to the inside of the case. Not the fraud, not the boardroom, not the moment the vote came down. The engraving on the inside of the watch cover, cut so fine you would never find it unless you knew watches, and the 2 words Nate put there that only Keanu Reeves in all the world could read. I keep thinking about what it means to build a thing like that. Not a message shouted, not a document filed with a lawyer, but a secret cut by hand into the one object you trust to outlive you, aimed at exactly one person, sent out with no way of knowing it would ever arrive. Nate Calder had a few hours and a stranger's hands, and no reason on earth to believe any of it would work. And he did it anyway. He engraved the location of the truth into a watch, and pressed it into a drowning man and told him to run. And then he trusted the current, and the years, and one particular man's eyes on one particular morning. That is not hope. Exactly. 6 knots. Hope is passive. This was something a watchmaker does, which is to build a mechanism so carefully that it will keep the right time long after the hand that made it is gone, and then to let go, and to trust the machine. He was right too. That is the part that stays with me. He built it right, and then he trusted it. And 8 years later, on Montgomery Street, it kept perfect time. While this story is fictional, the lessons about how easily the world agrees to stop seeing the people it has decided do not count, and how much truth can be lost in that blindness, are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.